You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, live from quarantine, Eric Johnson, and with my co-host, Zarak Khan. How is your quarantine going, Zarak?
Hello. Well, as of about 10 minutes ago, my quarantine is going amazing. There's a traffic jam literally outside of my window right now. There's a park across the street, and there's a man walking a full-sized pig on a leash. And it's really kind of pushing the limits of social distancing because everyone really wants to get close to this pig. So I've been watching that, and honestly, I'm going to try to maintain focus on our conversation, but I can't make total promises that that's going to happen.
We won't blame you for that. These are the type of things you can probably only experience right now in the middle of weeks, if not months long quarantine. So enjoy the moment while it lasts.
I'm soaking it up.
So for today, we are excited to finally have a really good friend of Action Design on the show, Dan Egan, who works at Betterment. He'll explain a little bit more about this. He's also just generally an expert in investor behavior. And today we're going to work on covering some of the things that are going on related to the coronavirus situation that's going on, but through the lens of kind of investor behavior. Obviously, there's a lot of market volatility and things going on around. So before we kind of dive into that, Dan, could you give us just a quick introduction to yourself and what you do and all that sort of stuff?
Definitely. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to not take it as saying anything about our relationship, that it took a global pandemic and a stock market crash for you to finally have me on. Just coincidence. Sure.
You need to find your true friends in urgent and desperate times. So yeah. That's where I'll put it.
Well, so yeah, I am the director of behavioral finance at Betterment, which is a online investment advisor. It's colloquially known as a robo-advisor. I've been there for about 7 years now. So I know where I've been through multiple sort of little drawdowns, and this is definitely the biggest one that we've been through so far. Before that, I worked for Barclays Wealth, which is a little bit more like a high net worth wealth management firm, doing very similar stuff, but usually with people who have much larger balances, more commas in their balance statements and so on. But what's interesting is you find that sort of the humans are still humans, regardless of the number of commas they have.
Awesome. Well, so given your background and all that, we wanted to bring you on because, obviously there's a lot going on in the world. And one aspect of it is there's a lot of kind of economic uncertainty, especially as it relates to kind of our finances and our investments. So why don't we kind of start by doing kind of a broader overview? If you could tell us a little bit about, how do you define topics like behavioral finance, investor behavior? What are some of the kind of core tenets of those subjects? And how does it especially apply to volatile times in the market like we're going through right now?
One of the interesting things I've come to over the years is that usually I look at it in terms of the actual outcomes that the person experiences. So a good example of this is things like the Save More Tomorrow program, where you're looking at sort of the design of a system and the way it's set up and how it interacts with human behavior. And sometimes the most effective way to change an outcome is to sort of remove human behavior, to require people to do less if possible and still experience a pretty good outcome. So within the team, I work with CFPs who are, qualified, credentialed financial planners, investing experts. And I sort of view it as my job as a lot of the advice that we deliver goes through digital mediums, be it a smartphone app or a website or the content that we write. And we have to figure out how to do that effectively. And effectively might mean that people don't log in frequently and don't have to change a lot of things, that we're constantly tweaking and tuning their accounts and their settings and so on to improve their outcomes. So there's a balance of the behavioral science side of things is understanding how human psychology interacts with the system and the product that you are building. And it has to be a win, both for your customers as well as for the company, and trying to find those sort of win-win situations and push hard on them from a design, either of the actual interface or of the service as a whole.
So give us some experience on that, and we'll jump into, the specifics of what's going on right now in a second. But more broadly, given your experience in designs and pushing towards those investor outcomes, what's different about, there's obviously the market's always going up and down occasionally, but there are times that are, generally more volatile, more uncertain. How does kind of behavior change in those times, and how does that affect, those outcomes, and how you try to push people towards what their kind of financial goals are when times like this are more uncertain and generally more emotional tend to happen?
Yeah, I think this is. I do want to say, like, I've been investing through the 2001 tech bubble, the 2008 financial crisis. There have actually been a number of, like, oh, is the government going to shut down? The Greek debt crisis, like various little things over my life, and I genuinely think this is, as a human, the scariest one I've ever been through. And it's not so much just about sort of finance or economics, because it also involves health. It involves the fear of people who you care about dying, whether or not that's a loved one, whether or not, the sort of almost uncertainty of, I might be infected and not even know it. So from a holistic point of view, taking sort of markets and jobs and employment out of it, this is still very scary and is going to drive a lot of changes in human behavior. It's, I mean, like the very nature of it, that it drives us apart from each other. Like I was thinking during the 2008 crisis, one of my fallbacks was, well, if I get laid off, it's okay. I can move back in with my parents. And here we're in this situation where that's exactly the opposite of something I'd be able to do. So even setting aside the finance and economic side of things, I think this is a very, scary, anxiety-provoking situation that we're in. And it has, because of all the overhead associated with changing patterns of behavior and logistics, where do you live? How do you get your food, et cetera? It's a not fun situation to be in. I think that there are steps that we can take to mitigate that and mitigate how much it drives us to making impulsive or short-termist or myopic decisions. But I think one of the first steps is saying, if you're scared, you're not wrong. This is big and this is scary, and it is worth taking a step back and saying, how do I make sure that I am safe, my family, my loved ones are safe? What can I do to put ourselves into a better situation, and kind of like worry about the nitty gritty of stock markets and so on later.
So yeah, it's interesting to think about like the different types of risks that are involved with these things and the way that we respond to those, right? I mean, because I would imagine that in your role, you're helping people think through or plan for risks that are often like voluntary, right? Like they're deciding like whether they want to invest here or there, and there are some understanding of potential benefits, even though there's kind of risk involved with that. But it sounds like what you're saying is that kind of this time around, for you and what you're observing with other people are perceiving those risks differently. And a couple of things that jump out to me are like, people think differently and are more tolerant of things like risks that are familiar versus risks that are exotic, right? People are more tolerant of risks that they can personally control versus those that are controlled, or at least perceived to be controlled by others. They're more tolerant of things that are kind of endemic versus epidemic. So, to what extent are you trying to account for that type of stuff in, the work that you're doing, and also the way that you kind of are thinking about this personally?
One of the things that I always come back to is that we often want to create an archetype of people where we catch most of their behavior in one sort of archetype or stereotype. And I think that's one of the downsides to it. What we're seeing is that there is a diversity of reactions to this across the board and in different areas. So up until recently, I was still seeing videos of young people going out to bars together because they're like, well, this doesn't seem too risky for me personally. Similarly, in investing, if somebody I actually went in and looked at some of the statistics amongst our client base, and it's actually quite easy to start pulling out and predicting who's going to be reacting in what way. Like if you're a relatively new client and you kind of don't have a buffer or a built up set of gains inside of your account, and you're coming into it now, you're just seeing sort of 10, 20% losses from the get-go. It's new. It's something you're paying attention to. If you're inexperienced with investing, you're more likely to say, this doesn't seem like it works, and I'm really scared, and I'm going to undo this decision, and I want to get right back out of this quickly. If you are someone who was invested through 2008 and still has 10, 20, 15 years till retirement and is salaried, et cetera, you are probably more looking at this as an opportunity. right? It's like, wait, like, can I put more money into the IRAs? Can I accelerate the 401ks and so on? So one thing is that there's not really one good archetype to use because it really depends on a specific situation that somebody is in. There is, I think one of the things that I worry about with these things is that we're going to focus on and talk about the people who are doing something. And I recently wrote a piece, I think it's up on my website, about panicky, the myth of the panicky investor. And one of the things that we see in general is that the vast majority, say something like 70, 80% of people aren't reacting. They might be reacting in other ways. They might be going more risk averse. They might be in their personal lives. They might be taking money out of emergency accounts, et cetera. But they're not really reacting inside their retirement accounts or other accounts because it's not a priority. It's not something they're looking to deal with right now. On the other hand, when you look at who is doing something, it's very sort of binary where either people are very concerned and they're sort of doing the flight to cash, flight to safety. I just can't take losing anymore. Or they're in the, like the market's on sale. This is the best thing ever. I can't wait to look back in 20 years and see what prices I bought at type thing. One of the other big, and this is really tough sort of coming about it from a financial planner point of view, but one of the big differences there is in how prepared people were coming into this. So one of the things that we try and quote unquote nudge as much as possible to do is to have an emergency fund set up. And that is to leverage mental accounting to say, okay, I'm going to save up this. We generally recommend 3 to 6 months worth of income. And that was based originally on, Bureau of Labor Statistics data about unemployment rates and how long you need to worry about being unemployed. And if you have that and you have that set aside in its own little bucket, that's like, this is my safety net. When things get bad, if I'm worried about my income, I'm going to take my money out from there. That segregated account allows you to go, okay, I've got my safety net. I don't need to worry about that short-term money. That means I'm going to continue to and feel comfortable taking risks in my retirement portfolio. So again, it's even within the person, it might be very bifurcated. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't have well-funded safety nets for themselves. And so maybe they have 1 month or 2 months, maybe they have even less and they're looking at sort of unemployment benefits. But people are coming into this in a very different circumstance, and their behavior and how they're going to see this is going to vary very much by that circumstance.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think I'd like to go back to think about, there's always market dips, but what is different about this one and what might change from this one? I think that's a really, I really like the point you made earlier, and that like, it's understandable to be afraid. Like another, I was younger, when 2008 happened, I had just graduated college. I was in my first job. Like thankfully I had gotten a job before that. And it was definitely kind of a scary time. But I think I was so young and so new to stuff. It just felt like, well, and also just someone who's a little more read on finance is like, well, these things do happen sometimes. Like there's going to be recessions and there's going to be ups and downs. And like, in some ways, something like 2008 feels like a known threat because we've gone through things like that before. But there definitely is a difference to this one. And I think a lot of it gets to thinking at this point of like emergency funds, for example, where like it's unprecedented for the economy to just stop for a month or two. Like that has never happened.
Yep.
And, we look at the threat that small businesses are facing, and that, people who are in, hourly work and stuff that generally don't have those kind of safety nets. Given that and other things, like what are some other things that do make this kind of different, and how might some of those things affect financial behavior in the short term and potentially in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable to me. I think so one of the things that people were talking about is the possibility of stock markets shutting for a while, or just sort of being turned off because of how volatile things are. And the precedent that we have for things like that is like World War I, where effectively it was like, maybe we just don't want to focus on this right now. We need to gear up the economy for a specific kind of production. So taking a step back, I think number one, exactly as you said, we've never dealt with exactly this kind of a economic problem before. And one of the asymmetries going on right now is that a lot of the news, and especially what you're going to see on social media and various things, are effectively fear provokers. Fear spreads faster. It tends to be shared more. It's very hard to interpret a lot of what is coming out right now as doing anything besides sort of creating and encouraging fear. And, in the short term, that's good because it provokes people and motivates them to take action. But I do think that we are in a sort of interesting circumstance where we're not taking into account the effects of our own actions and what we have available to do. So like during World War I and World War II, the economy really switched and became on this sort of war footing, a production engine of non-consumer goods, but where everybody was very much employed. And I think we're starting to see that now, where people who might otherwise, their factories might otherwise be shuttered, beer producers are switching over to creating hand sanitizer. Like it's actually not taking too long for us to switch to a wartime footing against this specific threat that we're facing. That's a germ of some kind. And I think that's a big element of feeling like, here's the known threat. Here is what you as an individual can do to fight it. And the more active that fighting is, the more in control you are. My mother was recently asked to sew, surgical masks, like protection masks for their local hospital. And she was actually relieved. She was like, great, now I'm not just sitting around worrying about this thing. I can actually actively be contributing to the fight to it. So the health aspects of it, the fact that it drives us away from each other, the kind of, shuttering of the economy in a way that we've never seen before. These are all new and scary and novel, worrying for both those reasons. But at the same time, we're very good at kind of like, if we can, taking that and saying, okay, all of the wait staff need to get repurposed into delivery staff so that we can continue to have them be employed and get food out there. I think we're underestimating to some degree how good our drive at finding solutions to problems when we're allowed to is gonna adapt to this new circumstance.
I think that leads well into kind of our last question here for you, which is basically, what are the things that people can be doing or can be thinking about? And you've touched on a number of these already, so I might just kind of ask you to kind of think about sort of how you kind of package these things together. But, you mentioned things like giving people a sense of control, a sense of direction, as well as kind of like why people might be coming from different places based on how prepared they were coming into this. So, what are the things that people can be doing to manage kind of our financial anxiety or our psychology around these decisions at this time?
I think a big one is being open to change and adapting the way you go about things. Not sort of saying like, oh, I want to get back to the way that it was as quickly as possible and I'll wait, but actively saying, this is a new normal and I want to proactively adapt to it quickly. This might be things like, okay, I'm not going to the gym anymore. I'm going to have to exercise at home. What does that look like? Like I went out and bought some sort of foam pads to make sure that I and my wife could exercise at home because we want to be able to do that. That's a big stress relief.
I know. I've been trying to find a pull-up bar for like a week now, and they're like very difficult to find at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah. So obviously exercise, anything that gets the endorphins flowing. There are other cardiovascular activities that help out with that. I think that there's, especially in terms of information, being thoughtful about how and when you consume news and various other things. Both my wife and I have activated sort of the apps on our phones that block out news and social media except for very specific hours, and you are absolutely not allowed to do it for 90 minutes before you go to bed. Everybody needs to be getting a good night's sleep and not worrying when we're going to sleep. So more sort of like thought control and especially outsourced self-control. We've leaned into a lot using things like Zoom and having reading time with other people's kids. I've actually been speaking more with my parents than I think I have in the past. So you have to be physically distant, but you do not have to be socially distant, and figuring out how to remain as social as possible using technology. I'm blown away. This would have been incredibly worse, I don't know, sort of 15 years ago when we couldn't do video calls and when we couldn't be sort of socially close but physically distant. And one of the big things I also think is a lot of us are in a very good situation. If you are salaried and you're able to work from home, if you're still getting paid, figure out as much as possible what you can do to help out. And that might be when we told our dog walkers that we didn't need them anymore. We said, cool, and I imagine you're getting a lot of these. We're going to double how much we're paying you because some people are going to cancel because they have to. We don't. So we'll try and help offset them. There are websites where you can go to help deliver food and medicine to older people who might not be able to go to the stores anymore. So there's lots of kind of like figure out what you are capable and how you are capable of helping. Because I don't see a world in which like we need all of us to come out of this in a good spot together. It can't be that like a minority of us come out okay. The majority of us have to come out, and that means you keep spending, you keep giving money to the people who are in the most in need, you keep finding ways to support each other. And there's a lot of work to do out there right now if you can go and look for it. But you have a lot of power to kind of fight, quote unquote, the pandemic as a whole. You just need to adjust and adapt to the new situation.
It's a great response, and it's funny because I think it kind of reveals a little bit of a flaw in our question, which is really like, I don't know that there's a great way of sort of segmenting off your psychology and anxiety around finances from just all of these other things in your life, right? And some of the things that you've noted have been, I've been saying that a lot and using that phrase of like making distance social, and so, like you have to be physically distant, but you do need to be socially connected, and we've been finding all kinds of ways of kind of doing that too. That definitely has seemed to help.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that managing your finances well, a lot of times just means keeping other things as normal as possible. Like you said, like exercise, like if you're getting really stressed, like exercise helps with stress. Sleeping helps with stress. Avoiding, we know that like, there's studies on too much information, like reading the financial news too much causes you to maybe trade more, which is worse for your portfolio generally. And that also helps your stress. Like a lot of these things really kind of come together as one. And I also just really like the point of thinking as individuals, there is, especially if we are salaried and less affected by this than others. Another thing that helps us stress a lot is like giving. Like there's a lot of psychological benefits to giving, donating, and helping people that are in need, like people that work in businesses and restaurants and stuff in your neighborhood that you like a lot, like you want those to stay around and like you appreciate them around, like doing more and taking control over that can be really helpful psychologically for your own well-being, and in turn that helps your health, your finances, and all those kind of things.
There are two things I do most evenings to make sure that I'm going to have a positive night's sleep. One is that I do, like when I put my daughter to bed, we talk about what are good things that happened today. And, we don't use the word with her, but we're practicing gratitude and trying to be conscious of it. And the other thing is I try to remind myself, like, what is the recovery going to look like? Imagine sort of what we're going to look like a year or 18 months from now. It will happen. We are going to get through this. It's very easy to focus on the negatives, but put in the time to imagine what it's going to feel like when the peak has passed us and we're actually hearing good news every day, when the first news of a successful vaccine comes out, when the hospitals start emptying. It's going to happen. Start imagining and thinking about it now, just to give yourself that sort of emotional reserve of this will pass too.
That's great advice. And, humanity has faced these things before in times of, much worse technology and ability than we have. Like it was a little over 100 years ago when the Spanish flu was like the epidemic, and, we had far less medical technology. We had far less resources in general. And at Roaring 20s happened right after that. So, it's definitely a scary and uncertain time. And like you said, it's okay to feel that way and accept that there's reasons for that, but there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot to be optimistic about too.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, we're running up on our time here. So I'll say, is there any kind of last parting thoughts you want to share with the audience before we head out?
No, just take care of yourself and try and find opportunities to get us all out of this. We can do it. You just need to go out there and try and join the effort.
Definitely. And for one last thing, just, if people want to learn more about your work, keep in touch with what you're up to, where can they find you online, things like that?
So I make lots of bad jokes on Twitter. My handle is @Daniel_Egan. That's EGAN. And my website where I write occasionally is dpegan.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, especially on some short notice here. And, hopefully we'll have you on again for a longer discussion and a little less, little happier times.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it.
For sure. All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.